They laughed at us for 6 years before they understood what the laughter was going to cost them. The Conquered Assembly kept two names for humanity. The first was the clean one. It sat in the official registry between the Threnic of Ash Colony 9 and the Asuvane of the Coral Deep. That name was Kalan, neutral, filed, forgettable. The second name lived only in private channels. It lived in the quiet after summits when delegates dropped the careful posture they wore in public and said what they actually believed. That name was the Barking Ones. Humanity had arrived on the galactic stage the way a child crashes a funeral. Loud, certain, entirely unaware that it had walked into something never built for it. The first transmission humanity ever sent past its own solar system was not a greeting. It was not a treaty offer. It was a single music file, something called rock and roll, blasted across 17 star systems at full signal strength. It bounced off relay towers that had taken 2 centuries of careful calibration to build. The Asuvane were creatures of extraordinary acoustic sensitivity whose entire language ran on sound. They described the experience afterward as something between a slap and a scream. The Vernesh, patient, gray-skinned, elder statesman who had guided galactic diplomacy for 6,000 years, called an emergency session that lasted 4 hours. Humanity never learned it happened. That was the year 2187. By 2190, humanity had sent 3 delegations, 2 research fleets, and 1 strongly worded letter to a species it had mistaken for an entirely different species. By 2195, it had provoked a trade dispute with the Korvath, offered an alliance to a civilization extinct for 3 centuries, and through sheer baffling persistence negotiated mining rights in a sector it had no legal claim to whatsoever. The elder species watched all of it. They did not intervene. There was an old theory among the ancient civilizations that young species either burned fast and collapsed or grew slow and endured. Humanity did neither. It burned fast and somehow did not collapse. The Vernesh filed this under anomalous and assigned a junior analyst to keep watching. Her name was Illith. She had 4 eyes, 12 fingers, and the patience of something that had personally watched 3 solar systems go dark. She filed her first report on humanity in the spring of 2198. It read in full that they were going to be a problem. Her supervisor made her rewrite it with softer language. The final version said the Kalan species displayed non-standard developmental patterns and warranted continued observation. It meant the same thing. The laughter began small the way most cruelty does. A joke among friends, affectionate at first, then sharper. Then something with an edge nobody wanted to examine too closely. The Korvath started it. Their ambassador to the assembly was a pale creature with too many joints and a voice like a blade dragged across glass. He coined a phrase that spread through diplomatic channels like a slow infection, the soft species. It was not wrong exactly. Humans had no natural armor, no venom, no echolocation. No second brain, no redundant organs beyond a single spare kidney their own doctors seemed to consider inadequate. They bled easily, they broke easily. They needed food every few hours or they became by their own admission irritable. They needed a narrow temperature band to function at all. Too hot and they died, too cold and they died, too wet and they got sick, too dry and they got sick. They had a condition called allergies in which their own immune systems attacked harmless particles in the air, and they treated this as a minor inconvenience rather than the evolutionary failure it plainly was. Every single one of them had to stop functioning entirely for hours every single night. The Korvath found this so funny they built it into a training module for young diplomats as an example of how not to design a species. The Asuvane composed a 17-movement acoustic piece about it. A third species communicated through chemical signals and released a pheromone blend that translated roughly to bless their hearts, which in that species meant they do not know any better and we should not be cruel about it, and also underneath that we are glad we are not them. Humanity, loud and busy and spilling across the midrim like something that had knocked over a glass of water and was trying to mop it up with its bare hands, heard none of it, or seemed not to. The war came in 2219, not with humanity. That was the part nobody discussed afterward in the careful silences of the council chambers. The war did not involve humanity. It moved near them, through them. Across a corridor of space, the assembly had handed to the Kalan expansion zone years earlier without much thought, because at the time humanity had seemed like the kind of nabe. Or that would never need defending. The official record calls it the Vethrine conflict. It lasted 14 months. The unofficial name used in casualty reports was the Choke War because the contested corridor formed a narrow passage between 2 sectors and whoever held it held everything behind it. Humanity held the choke. They did not start the war. That needs to be stated plainly. They had no stake in the ideological dispute between the Vernesh arbiters and the Korvath. They had submitted 3 formal petitions asking for the fighting to be relocated since it was disrupting their shipping lanes and causing what their ambassador called with spectacular understatement some logistical inconvenience. The petitions were ignored. The assembly was busy fighting a war, so humanity did what humanity always did. It adapted quietly. Illith was watching when it began, not the moment humanity entered the conflict. That happened much later and never officially. What she noticed first was smaller, a single anomaly buried in the shipping logs of the choke. 3 Kalen cargo vessels had gone dark, no distress call, no wreckage signature, no debris field on any long-range scanner. One day they were logged in the transit registry running standard routes. The next day they simply were not there, not destroyed, not diverted, not even late. Just gone, she flagged it as probable Corvette interdiction since the Corvette were known to strike soft civilian targets. 2 weeks later, 4 more ships vanished the same way, no debris, no signal. Illith studied the pattern a long time, then she checked where the missing ships had last registered, every single one at the edge of the choke on the Kalan side. She pulled every passive scan available for that region. Gravity readings, thermal bloom from engine wash. She found nothing. Not the nothing of empty space which has its own texture if you know how to read it. The nothing of something that had learned to erase itself from the record entirely. Her second report read simply that the Kalan were not where anyone believed them to be. Her supervisor did not ask her to soften it that time. The battle that later became known as Corin's Verge was supposed to be a rout. The Corvette had pushed a major force through the upper channel of the choke, while the Vernish forces were stretched thin along the southern line. It was clean strategy, predictable, the kind of move that ends wars before the final engagement even happens. Vernish Senior Command had already opened preliminary talk of surrender terms. The Corvette fleet moved through the upper channel and stopped cold. Not because they struck a Vernish defense line. There was no defense line in the upper channel. Corvette intelligence had confirmed the absence of Vernish forces 3 separate times before committing to the maneuver. They stopped because something that had never appeared on any scan or registry and had gone undetected for the entire 4 months they had been watching that stretch of space stepped out of the dark directly in their path. Not one ship, 11 Kalan ships. Not the cargo haulers and hopeful little research frigates the galaxy associated with humanity. Something else entirely. Long, dark, running cold. Built with angles that refuse to reflect sensor pings the way angles should. Carrying weapons arrays the Corvette tactical systems needed 3 full seconds to even categorize because nothing like them had ever been logged before. 3 seconds is a very long time inside a firefight. The Corvette Admiral sent an identification request. The reply came back in standard Galactic Common, which humanity had only officially learned 8 years earlier and had apparently gotten remarkably good at. We are the ones whose shipping lanes you disrupted. Then the lead vessel opened fire without a single marking visible anywhere on its hull. Illith watched the engagement unfold from a Vernish monitoring post at the edge of the verge. She watched it the way a person watches something they had been told was impossible actually happening in front of them. A strange sensation settled where certainty used to sit. The Kalan ships did not fight the way any council species fought. They formed no defensive lines. They broadcast no tactical chatter anyone could intercept, or if they did it rode a frequency nobody could break. They moved as a single unit, and then at some moment she could not pinpoint they stopped being a unit and became 11 separate decisions unfolding at once, which was somehow worse to watch because there was no center left to strike. The Corvette tried to target the lead ship. The lead ship did not accelerate away in any conventional sense. It was simply gone and then present somewhere else entirely. The weapons it had already fired from its original position kept traveling and struck something regardless. The Corvette fleet lost 22% of its total strength in the first 9 minutes. In minute 11, the Corvette had me. Ral opened a general channel. He did not address the Vernish. He spoke directly to the Kalan. He requested terms. The response took a moment to arrive. Then you should have thought about our shipping lanes. A pause followed. Then instructions. Coordinates would be sent. Come with 1 vessel. Leave your weapons at the edge of the verge. We will be watching. Then all 11 dark ships, the ones that had crossed 14 months of active war without detection even once, went silent. The Corvette Admiral sat in his command chair a long time before asking his tactical officer where they had come from. She checked her instruments twice. She told him honestly that she did not know. Illith filed her 3rd report the morning after Corin's Verge. It ran far longer than the first 2. It carried sensor logs, trajectory analysis, weapons signature databases, a 12-page section on what she had started calling deliberate signal absence. the active sustained effort to remain unseen that the Kalen fleet had apparently maintained for somewhere between 8 and 14 months before the battle. They had not vanished by accident, they had rehearsed it. Her closing section was one paragraph. The Kalen species has been characterized in council records as a soft civilization prone to noise, unprepared for sustained conflict, and unlikely to represent a meaningful military presence in the midrim. This characterization is no longer accurate if it was ever accurate at all. The Kalen did not build an army, they built a ghost. The Korvath collective met that ghost in the dark, and the Vethrine conflict ended 9 minutes later. She recommended the Assembly revise its assessment of the Kalen species immediately. She also recommended that whoever wrote the original assessment consider whether the laughter had been wise. Her supervisor read it 3 times and forwarded it to the full Assembly without a single change. For the first time in 41 years of observation work, Illith was not asked to rewrite anything. The Assembly convened an emergency session 7 days after Corin's verge. Every seat was filled. That had not happened in 30 years. The last time was the Asuvane aquifer crisis, which had threatened to collapse the bioport infrastructure of 3 inhabited systems. Before that, it was the Regency dispute, which had nearly become a shooting war on its own. Corin's verge filled every seat in 6 hours. The Vernesh sent 2 representatives instead of 1 for the first time since the founding session, when the rules of quorum were still being written. The Korvath sent their senior ambassador, who almost never traveled, and their lead military attaché, whose existence the Korvath almost never admitted publicly. The Asuvane arrived in a sealed atmospheric chamber and sat at the back making sounds below the range of the translation systems, which everyone present understood was not a malfunction. They were discussing humanity in private. The session opened with Illith's report read in full by the Vernesh Council Secretary. 47 pages, including the 12-page section on deliberate signal absence and the closing paragraph that had already reached 6 different intelligence offices before the ink was dry. The room stayed very quiet the entire time. When the reading ended, the Korvath senior ambassador raised one hand and asked a single precise thing. He wanted to know how long the Kalen ships had been sitting in the verge before the engagement. The council secretary checked her notes. Current analysis suggested a minimum of 4 months and possibly longer. Sensor reconstruction placed the earliest likely entry at roughly 11 months before the battle. The ambassador absorbed this slowly. For 11 months, while the Korvath ran 3 dedicated sensor teams on continuous sweeps of that corridor. While they tracked every vessel entering or leaving the sector, they were there the entire time and nothing was detected. The Vernesh representative confirmed it plainly. Correct, the ambassador sat back and did not speak again for the rest of the session. What followed was not an investigation. Technically, the Assembly had no legal mechanism to investigate a member species that had broken no law. Humanity had violated no treaty. It had in fact ended a 14-month war in 11 minutes without filing a single piece of pre-authorization paperwork, which several council members privately struggled to categorize as anything but beneficial. The Vernesh legal division spent 3 weeks on it. Their conclusion, delivered in the careful language of entities who had practiced law for 6,000 years, was that humanity had technically acted in defense of its own territorial zone, had technically used force proportional to the threat, and had technically not exceeded the rights of a member species protecting its own shipping infrastructure. What it was not technically or otherwise was expected. So instead of an investigation, the Assembly requested a consultation. A consultation was softer. It implied dialogue. It was the sort of request you filed when you wanted answers and did not want to admit you needed them. The request went to the Kalen ambassador, a woman named Selene Akoro, 3 years in post, carrying in the opinion of most of the Assembly the specific energy of someone who always knew more than she said and had long ago decided that was the correct way to live. She replied within the hour that she would be happy to talk whenever the Assembly found it convenient. The phrasing was so mild that 3 separate translation systems flagged it as potentially ironic. The consultation took place in the main chamber. Selene arrived alone, not alone in the sense of forgetting to bring staff, alone in the sense of someone who had weighed the optics carefully and arrived anyway with the precise bearing of a person who found the room slightly less impressive than the room wanted to be found. She was not physically large. She was not visually imposing. She wore a plain dark uniform with no insignia at all, which was itself a kind of statement, since every other delegate in the chamber wore insignia, readable like a full sentence of rank and house and achievement. She wore nothing. The Vernesh senior representative opened the session by thanking her for attending and explaining that the assembly had questions about the events at Corin's Verge and hoped she could offer some context. Of course, she said. The primary question, he continued, was how 11 Kalen military vessels operated undetected inside a sector under active multi-party surveillance for as long as 11 months. Selene looked at him with the specific patience of someone waiting for a sentence to be finished that had not yet been started. That is not something she was able to discuss in detail. She hoped he understood. The room did not understand. Nobody said so. He tried again, asking when the capability had been developed, since Kalen military records held by the Council showed nothing of the kind. She told him some things stayed off the main records. She hoped he understood. The room began to understand that she was going to keep saying that phrase, and that each time it would carry a slightly different meaning. The Korvath military attaché leaned forward. He was a soldier wearing a diplomat's chair badly. He asked how many ships could do what those 11 had done at the Verge. She smiled a small smile, not unkind. The smile of someone who appreciated the directness of the question while having no intention whatsoever of answering it. Enough, she said. The consultation ended 2 hours later without a single real answer. Or rather, it ended with a precise and careful set of non-answers delivered with such warmth that most delegates did not realize until they were back at their own desks that they had learned nothing at all. Nothing about the ship design, nothing about fleet size, nothing about when the capability had been built, nothing about whether humanity had done this before somewhere else under a different name. What they got instead was a pleasant meeting with a small woman in a dark uniform who drank 2 cups of something called coffee that made the Asuvane filtration systems react with alarm, and who thanked the assembly for its time before walking out at exactly the same calm pace she had walked in with. Ilith had attended as a junior observer. Afterward, she sat at her desk and wrote 1 line in her notes. She was not surprised by a single question asked today. She stared at that sentence a long time. Not surprised meant Selene had anticipated every question before she ever entered the room, which meant she had known what the assembly would ask, which meant she had known what the assembly knew and what it did not know and had shaped her answers accordingly. Which meant that however closely the Council believed it had been watching humanity all these years, humanity had apparently been watching the Council back with a noticeably better intelligence operation. The Korvath filed a formal information request 3 weeks after the consultation, addressed to the Kalen government under Council Treaty Protocol, demanding a full accounting of Kalen military assets in the Midrim. The response arrived in 11 days. A thorough 18-page document properly formatted, stamped with the correct authentication codes, signed by the correct authorities. It listed 6 Kalen military vessels in the entire Midrim sector. Zaref Vel Korvath stared at it. He had counted 11 ships at the Verge with his own sensor logs and his own tactical officers' recordings. 11 ships. The document said 6. He filed a follow-up. The response was a polite clarification explaining that the 6 vessels listed represented the Kalen assets formally registered in the Midrim sector under Council Treaty Protocol. Formally registered. He read that phrase 7 times. Then he sent someone to find out what formal. Why registered actually meant under Kalen legal code, and what separated formally registered from present. It took his legal staff a full month to find the clause. It sat buried inside the Kalen Military Transparency Annex submitted during the original treaty negotiations of 2201, in a section reviewed at the time by exactly 2 council analysts who had both found it uninteresting. The clause read in full that assets operating in stealth-designated configurations during active defensive operations were not subject to standard registry disclosure requirements for the duration of said operations. Stealth-designated configurations. The Korvath legal team read it again. It had been sitting in the treaty for 18 years, since a time when humanity had seemed like the kind of species you assigned a junior analyst to watch out of politeness. They had exempted their own stealth assets from disclosure inside a routine transparency clause, and nobody had noticed for nearly 2 decades. Ilith was the one who found the original review notes. She was not looking for them. She was doing routine archive maintenance between crises and pulled the 2201 treaty files to update an index. The review notes were there from the original council assessment of the Kalen Transparency Annex. 2 pages written by a pair of mid-tier analysts whose names she recognized. The first had flagged the stealth clause and written in the margin that it was an unusual provision requiring clarification. There was no record that clarification had ever been requested. The second analyst had written that the Kalan were not a stealth-capable species, and that the provision was likely precautionary or aspirational and required no action. Aspirational. Illith sat with that word a long time. The galaxy had looked at humanity in 2201. Loud, soft, bumbling into confused trade disputes with rock and roll music echoing behind them and a single spare kidney that even their own doctors doubted. And had decided a stealth clause buried in their military treaty was just wishful thinking. They had decided humanity was dreaming. Nobody had considered that humanity was planning. The assembly held a second session after that, a closed one, no official record, no secretary. The kind of session held only when things had to be said that could never be written down. The Vernesh representative opened it by saying they needed to understand how much of what they believed about the Kalan was actually accurate. Nobody answered immediately because the answer everyone in that room had been arriving at independently for 6 weeks was deeply uncomfortable. What they knew about humanity was exactly what humanity had allowed them to know. What they did not know was everything else. And the everything else it was becoming clear was the part that actually mattered. The Asuvane representative made a sound the translation system rendered as we laughed at them, and they said nothing, and we laughed at them, and they kept building. She made a second sound that took the translation system 4 full seconds to process before rendering it as a wish to know what else had been built while everyone was busy laughing. The room stayed quiet a long time. Illith did not attend that closed session. She was still too junior. But a door had been left open somewhere metaphorically, and a summary found its way to her desk through channels she did not examine too closely. She read it and sat back for a while. Then she pulled up the star maps of the Midrim and marked every zone designated as Kalan expansion territory over the previous 20 years. She mapped their shipping routes, their colony positions, the gaps between them, the unsurveyed corridors. The regions no council sensor net covered with any real reliability. She began marking those regions on her own private chart. There were a great many of them. She thought about 11 ships sitting undetected in a dark corridor for 11 straight months. She thought about how large the unsurveyed corridors actually were. She thought about how many ships could hide inside all that dark. She set down her stylus and did not file anything that night. Some questions she had learned were better held quietly for a while before being made official. Some things needed time before you understood exactly how afraid you were supposed to be. 6 months after Corin's Verge, a survey vessel found something it had not been searching for. The Solving Drift was a mid-sized scientific ship with a crew of 14 mapping mineral deposits along the Outer Rim's third expansion belt, running passive sweeps of a region logged as uninhabited and uninteresting in the Council's Geographic Survey of 2188. That survey had apparently missed a few things. The drift's sensors picked up a small gravitational irregularity. The kind you could log as a stray geological formation and move on from without a second thought. But the ships. Science lead Doran Vey had spent 30 years learning to distrust easy answers and decided to look closer. What the closer look revealed was a structure, not a natural one, built into the shadow of a dead moon in a system with no registered inhabitants, running cold, running dark, reflecting no signal from the drift's active sweeps in a way Doran recognized immediately as intentional rather than accidental. You could build something that failed to reflect radar, but it took deliberate effort. Specific effort. She sent a priority signal to the Threnic Science Ministry and sat in her command chair thinking about the fact that this region had been marked uninhabited in 2188, and it was now 2220, and 32 years was a very long time to spend building something in the dark. The signal reached the assembly and eventually reached Illith, who by then had been promoted twice and led a team of 6 analysts. She had also over the preceding 6 months quietly begun a second private chart kept off every council system entirely of what she now called the seams. The dark corridors, the blind stretches, the places the light never quite reached. When the drift's report arrived, she checked her private chart. The dead moon sat inside one of the seams. Of course it did. She requested a survey mission, a scientific one rather than a military one. She was careful about the wording because she had learned in the months since the closed session that the word concern tended to trigger exactly the kind of visible diplomatic reaction that humanity would notice and adjust around. She wanted to see before she was seen looking. The mission was approved. A small neutral vessel with 1 Vernesh scientist, 2 Asuvane technicians, and a Threnic engineer under a brief to assess an anomalous formation. They reached the dead moon system in 11 days and found the structure. Then they found it was not alone. 3 large installations sat carved into the shadow faces of the moon, connected by tunnels bored straight through its interior. All three were cold and dark with no active power signature but the construction itself. The material, the scale, was clearly artificial and clearly recent. The Vernesh scientist on the survey sent back his first assessment in the careful tone of someone trying very hard to stay objective about something making him feel things he had not planned to feel. He placed the construction age between 8 and 15 years. He described the scale as significant, the design as optimized for concealment, the material as matching no registered KLN civilian construction profile on file. He did not describe what he believed the installations were built for. He did not need to. Ilith marked the site on her private chart and spent 2 weeks pulling archived shipping records, colony filings, and deep space beacon logs looking for anything cross-referenced with location data. She found more seams, not structures yet, but patterns of absence carrying the same signature as the choke before Corin's verge. Regions where signal traffic ran a little too clean, where survey data sat a little too old to trust, where the Assembly's knowledge stopped at the exact edge of what humanity had formally reported, and that formally reported edge sat in several cases very far behind where the real presence seemed to be. She added 7 new markers. Then she stared at the chart a long time. It looked like a net, not the kind of net you throw to catch something, the kind you build into the floor before inviting anyone inside, and then you wait and you are very friendly while you wait. You offer your guests coffee. You smile. You say you understand in that particular way and you wait. She was not certain this was what she was looking at. She was equally not certain it wasn't. The Assembly formally asked humanity about the dead moon installations through the standard diplomatic channel, a written inquiry requesting information on the nature and purpose of the structures found in the 3rd Expansion Belt Survey. The reply came back in 4 days, a polite letter that acknowledged the inquiry, thanked the survey team for its careful work, noted with what read as genuine appreciation that the Assembly had gone to the trouble of a proper scientific assessment, rather than simply sending a military observer, which the KLN government valued as a real gesture of good faith. Then it explained that the installations were KLN infrastructure built within KLN territorial designation for purposes relating to KLN strategic interests, and that under Council membership, protocol member species were not required to disclose internal infrastructure projects. It was signed by Ambassador Okoro. A handwritten note sat at the bottom offering to set up a meeting if the Assembly had further questions, and noting that the coffee had gotten quite good lately. The Korvath military attaché read the handwritten note 3 times when the Titur was shared with him. She is enjoying this, he said. Nobody disagreed. What the Assembly knew at this point ran roughly as follows. Humanity possessed a stealth fleet capability at least 20 years old hidden in plain sight inside a treaty annex. It had used that capability during the Vethrine conflict to position 11 vessels in a contested corridor for up to 11 months without detection. Those 11 vessels had ended a 14-month war in 11 minutes. The fleet's actual size remained unknown. The true extent of KLN military infrastructure remained unknown. There were at minimum 3 significant installations in the Outer Rim 3rd Belt and possibly more. What the Assembly did not know was everything else. How many ships, how fast, how armed, how far the dark installations stretched, who else knew, what the chain of command looked like, what trigger conditions existed, what humanity considered worth responding to, and how it responded once it decided something was. They did not know because humanity had not told them, and humanity had not told them not through oversight. The Assembly understood that clearly now. The gap between what humanity had disclosed and what humanity had actually built was not an accident. It was not carelessness. You do not hide a fleet for 20 years through carelessness. You do not bury a stealth clause in a treaty annex through carelessness. You do not build 3 installations in the shadow of a dead moon through carelessness. You do those things through intention, through patience, through the specific kind of long game that the Assembly had always assumed belonged only to old species. Species who had lived long enough to understand the galaxy was not always friendly and that you prepared for a threat before it ever arrived. Young species were not supposed to think that way. Young species were loud and impulsive and stumbled into trade disputes with civilizations that no longer existed. Except humanity had apparently been thinking exactly like that beneath all the noise the entire time. The Vernesh senior representative called Ilith into his personal office, not her supervisor's office, not a conference room, his own office with a window overlooking the station's observation ring. She had never stood inside it before, and it felt the moment she stepped in like a room that remembered every important conversation it had ever hosted. He did not offer her a seat. He stood at the window looking out at the stars and asked her plainly what she thought. She considered her words carefully. This was not a moment for careful diplomatic language. He was asking for something else entirely. The thing you say when the official version has stopped being enough. She told him they had been classifying humanity wrong from the very beginning. He asked how they had been classifying it. She said as a young species, developing, promising but unpredictable, loud, emotional, prone to mistakes. He asked what they actually were. She thought about 11 ships sitting silent in a contested corridor for 11 months. About a treaty clause filed in 2201 and ignored for 18 years. About 3 installations in the dark and a chart full of seams and an ambassador who drank coffee and smiled and said, "You understand." Old, she told him. They think like something very old. He was quiet a moment. That assessment will disturb the assembly, he said. Yes, she agreed. It will disturb a great many people. Yes. He turned from the window and told her to file it officially. She did. The report ran 60 pages this time. It included her private chart, the one she had kept off every council system for 6 months, the seams marked, the patterns annotated. She attached it as an appendix and noted in her cover letter that it was unofficial and based on inference rather than confirmed survey data, and that she was submitting it anyway because she believed the inference was strong enough to warrant official attention. Her section heading stayed careful and neutral, the way she had learned to write everything meant to be read by people who might not want to hear it. But her closing summary was not careful at all. It said in plain language what she had been building toward for 7 months. Humanity is not where we believe it is. It is not what we believe it is. It is not organized the way we assume, or armed the way we assume, or limited the way we assume. The gap between what the KLN have disclosed and what the available evidence suggests they have built is large enough that our current strategic assessment of the Midrim is unreliable. We are making decisions about a galaxy we do not fully see in a region where another species holds significantly better visibility than we do. That species has given us no indication of hostile intent. It has also given us no indication of its true capacity. I recommend the assembly stop laughing and start listening. I also recommend we listen more carefully than we have, because a species that stays quiet for a very long time is either harmless or ready. Given what happened at Corin's Verge, I no longer believe harmless is the correct conclusion. She submitted it and went home and did not sleep well, not from fear of what humanity might do. She lay in the dark thinking about the dead moon installations, about the seams, about the net-like pattern on her chart, about the fact that none of it resembled aggression. It resembled preparation. There was a real difference, and the difference mattered, but it kept slipping away from her in the dark because preparation could be aimed at almost anything. You could prepare for defense. You could prepare to negotiate from strength. You could prepare for a war you hoped never to fight, or you could prepare to act and simply wait for the right moment with the specific patience of something very old and very quiet. She did not know which one this was. She was not sure she wanted to find out. 3 days after she filed the report, Ambassador Akoro requested a private meeting, not with the assembly, not with the senior representative, with Ilith personally. The request went through proper channels and included a note saying it was time for a real conversation and that Ilith had earned one. Ilith read it twice and sent back a single word asking when. The reply arrived 20 minutes later. Tomorrow, bring the chart. She stared at her screen a long time. Selene had seen her report. Selene had seen the chart built from pattern analysis and careful reading of things nobody else had thought to look for. And Selene's response was not a denial or a formal protest. It was an invitation. Sitting alone in her office very late that night with the stars turning slowly outside her window, Ilith understood that the conversation ahead was not going to make her feel better. It was going to make her feel exactly as small as the chart suggested she should feel. She wrote back yes anyway, because she was an analyst and analysts needed to know. The meeting took place in a small room on the station's civilian level. Not a conference room, not a diplomatic suite. A place that served food from no particular species cuisine and so served everything badly, which somehow made it feel neutral. 2 tables, 6 chairs, a window looking out at the docking ring. The low hum of a ventilation system the Asuvane always complained about. Selene was already seated when Ilith arrived, drinking coffee. A second cup waited on the table across from her, which meant she had done some research into what Ilith could safely drink and had ordered it in advance. Ilith looked at the cup, looked at Selene, sat down. Selene thanked her for coming. Ilith reminded her that she had been the one to invite it. Selene agreed that she had and said it was long overdue. Ilith pointed out that this meeting could have been requested at any point in the last 7 months. Selene agreed with that too and let the silence sit rather than explain it. Ilith was realizing this was something Selene did regularly, let an omission carry its own meaning. Ilith set her personal drive on the table. Selene glanced at it and noted that she had brought it. Ilith confirmed she had been asked to. Selene set down her cup and said there were things about that chart worth explaining. What Ilith had gotten right and what she had gotten wrong. Ilith asked her to tell her then. Selene studied her for a moment the way someone decides how to begin something with many possible beginnings. The structure of the chart was correct, she said. The logic. The way Ilith had traced the seams and the patterns of absence. That part was real work, genuine work, but Ilith did not yet understand what she was actually looking at. And Selene wanted to explain it because she believed Ilith had earned that much and would work it out eventually regardless. She would rather Ilith hear it from them than piece it together from a misread sensor log. Ilith stayed quiet. She was not surprised. She was not unsurprised either. She had spent so long building toward this moment that its arrival felt less like revelation and more like a door she had been standing in front of finally opening. "Tell me," she said. What Selene told her began with a date. 2293, 4 years after first contact, the year of the confused trade dispute with the Korvath. She asked if Ilith knew what had actually happened on the Kalen side during that dispute. The official record was thin. There had been a diplomatic resolution, an apology from the Kalen Trade Ministry and a revised shipping agreement. That was the part shown to everyone, she said. The part never shown was that in the 6 weeks before the apology, 3 Kalen trade delegates had received direct threats from private Korvath interests. 2 had been followed, 1 had been physically confronted. Ilith went very still. None of that had ever reached the council, she said. No, Selene agreed. It had been and led quietly, and afterward there had been a serious conversation at home about the kind of galaxy humanity had actually walked into. They had arrived assuming good faith. Loud and messy and honest the way you arrive when you assume the room is safe. The room had not been safe. The 2293 incident was not extraordinary, Ilith said carefully. No, Selene agreed. It was not. That was exactly the point. She turned her cup slowly in her hands and explained that they had studied the assembly closely afterward, studied the species that had existed for thousands of years, how they moved, how they spoke publicly and how they spoke privately. And they noticed something specific. The species that survived the longest were never the friendliest ones. They were the ones that had made themselves too expensive to attack. The program had a formal name inside the Kalen Defense Directorate. Selene used it once in passing and then set the name aside entirely and described only the substance of the thing itself. The core of it was simple. Humanity would become the most expensive possible target in the galaxy without anyone realizing it was happening, not through broadcasting strength, not through threats. Not through alliances that came bundled with obligations and dependencies and the kind of visible military presence that made other species nervous and prone to acting first. Through disappearing, not literally. They stayed exactly as loud and visible and clumsy as ever, still tripping into trade disputes and firing rock and roll into deep space and filing enthusiastic petitions about shipping lanes. All of that was completely real. The mess was real. Everything underneath it was a choice. While humanity stayed loud about the things, it did not mind people knowing it grew very quiet about everything else. The dark installations in the outer rim were never forward bases. They were never staging grounds for expansion. They were something the Assembly had failed to categorize because the category simply did not exist yet in Council's strategic thinking. They were deterrent infrastructure placed specifically where it would not be found easily. Built to be found eventually, but only by someone paying very close attention. Found and then understood as a fraction of a larger whole so that whoever found it would run the math and land on a number too large to want to test. You built a ghost army, Ilith said, and then made the ghost large enough to be genuinely terrifying. We built a guarantee, Selene corrected her, that attacking humanity would always cost more than it could ever be worth. Whatever you gained, you would spend more acquiring it than it would ever produce. Corin's verge was never supposed to happen, Selene said flatly. No apology in the statement and no pride either. They had not wanted to decloak, they had not wanted to fight. They had wanted the Korvath fleet to feel watched and simply withdraw. It had taken longer than expected. It worked, Ilith said. It worked, Selene agreed. And now you know we exist and we have to decide together what that means. The word together sat in the air between them a while. Ilith turned it over slowly. Together implied a choice being offered. It implied Selene had come to this meeting not to explain humanity's position but to negotiate something. Not with the Assembly, with her specifically. She asked why her. Selene did not deflect, because Ilith was the one who had been looking honestly. Everyone else on the council had spent their time searching for ways to categorize what humanity did that made it feel less alarming. Ilith had searched for what was actually there. They needed someone on the council side who saw clearly. And Illith needed to understand what she was actually seeing, so she would stop handing the assembly a picture that led to bad decisions. She asked what bad decisions meant. Panic decisions, Selene said. They had been watching the closed sessions. Illith went still and then let out a slow breath. Of course you have, she said. The instinct, Selene continued, when you find something larger than expected is to contain it, to counter it, to build something that matches it. They were asking Illith to help the assembly understand why that instinct would be a very serious mistake. Because you would know, Illith said, because we would know, Selene confirmed. The room stayed quiet. Outside the window the docking ring turned slowly. A Threnic freighter came into dock while an Asuvain courier pushed off the station's edge toward the transit lane. Ordinary things, the ordinary business of a galaxy that had been running for millennia. Beneath all of it, somewhere inside the seams, the dark thing sat waiting, not threatening, not approaching. Simply present the way a wall is present, the way something solid and patient sits there whenever you need to know it exists. You built this because of the Korvath, Illith said, for whatever the Korvath represented, the kind of force that follows. Someone alone and undefended, and teaches them exactly what that costs. The Korvath were the first to teach us that lesson clearly, Selene said. But no, not specifically for the Korvath, for anyone who looked at humanity and thought soft species easy target. She said it without heat. The way you state a calculation rather than a grievance. We are soft, that part is true. We break easily and bleed easily and need sleep every night, and our immune systems are frankly a disaster. All of that is true. We were never going to outfight the galaxy on those terms, so you change the terms, we change the terms. Selene spent the next hour being specific, not about numbers, not about locations, not about anything that would hand technical intelligence to someone less interested in stability than Illith was. She was specific about intent, about structure, about the underlying logic behind everything humanity had built. The stealth fleet existed to remain unknown. Its power came entirely from uncertainty. The moment its composition became known, the moment the assembly could calculate its size or its range or its limits, it stopped being a guarantee and became a simple calculation. Calculations could be worked around, uncertainty could not. The dark installations worked the same way. They were never fortresses, they were signs, the kind placed along the border of something you did not want entered. The sign itself was never the deterrent. Understanding what stood behind the sign was the deterrent. Corrin's Verge had been a last resort. The single most aggressive thing humanity had done in 30 years of quiet building, and it had lasted 11 minutes and ended in terms rather than annihilation, which was as controlled an outcome as any shooting engagement ever produces. You could have destroyed the Korvath fleet entirely, Illith said. It was not a question. We chose not to, Selene said. Illith asked why. Selene looked at her with the expression of someone who had expected exactly that question. Because a fleet you destroy stops being a lesson. A fleet that limps home and tells its own government what it saw in the dark. That is a lesson that stays. Illith thought about the Korvath military attaché sitting silent through the entire consultation session. About the formal information request and the legal team that had spent a month tracking down the treaty clause. She asked if that had been the entire point. Frightened people, said Selene. Frightened badly enough that they spend their energy worrying about you instead of attacking you. And people who would never attack at all barely notice the dark exists. The installations interfere with nobody. The ships stay home unless they are needed. A Threnic freighter captain running standard routes never sees a single trace of it. It is only visible to people already looking for it. And the people already looking for it are the people who have already considered testing you. She let that settle. We do not want war, she said. We have never wanted war. We want exactly what we came into this galaxy wanting. Trade, contact, cooperation. The chance to be part of something larger than one species on one small planet. All of that remains true. We simply learned early on that pursuing any of it required being safe enough to pursue it at all. The conversation ended the way important conversations end. Not with resolution, but with a new weight settled on the table that both of them understood they would now have to carry. Selene stood first. She picked up her cup and paused before leaving. Illith, she said, yes, the Assembly is going to discuss containment options, ways to match what they believe humanity has or limit its ability to expand. Selene was not asking her to stop that process. It was the Assembly's right to consider it. She was asking Illith to help them understand that any move in that direction would be watched and answered through the exact same framework humanity had already been operating inside for decades. Quietly, Illith said. Quietly, Selene agreed, and thoroughly. Then she left. Illith sat in that small room a long time after the ventilation hummed on and the docking ring kept turning. Somewhere beyond all the light of the station, the stars sat indifferent and enormous in their ancient positions. She thought about what she had just been told. Not everything. She understood she had been given a fraction shaped specifically to reassure without ever being complete. Selene was very good at that. Giving you enough truth to feel seen without quite enough to feel safe, because the gap itself was the actual message. But the core of it was real. Humanity was not an aggressor. Humanity was a prey species that had decided sometime around 2293 that it was finished being prey and had spent 27 years quietly making itself too expensive to hunt. It had done all of it in the dark, and it had been extraordinarily patient. And now the lights were on and the galaxy was finally looking at the thing it had spent years laughing at. And the thing it had been laughing at was looking directly back. She picked up her drive and thought about the chart, about the seams, about all the dark places marked as inferred but never confirmed. She thought that she had perhaps found 30% of what actually existed. She was not sure whether that made her feel better or worse. She tucked the drive into her pocket and walked out past the ventilation hum and the turning docking ring back toward the assembly's official spaces. She had a report to write, not the kind that alarmed. The kind that explained as carefully as she could manage the difference between a predator and a deterrent, between a species building toward aggression and a species that had looked at an unkind galaxy and quietly made certain it would never be unkind to them again specifically. The difference mattered, and the assembly needed to understand it because Selene had been right about one thing. Any move toward containment would be watched. And the thing doing the watching had 11 months of practice, sitting silently in the dark and missing nothing. The Callan Dominion arrived at the edge of the Midrim in the spring of 2221. Nobody saw them coming, not because they were subtle. They were the opposite of subtle. They arrived loud and hot and broadcasting the way a species arrives when it has decided the galaxy is a resource and grown tired of waiting to take its share. 600 years of isolated expansion sat behind them, a military culture built entirely on the premise that force answers every question. And an intelligence picture of the conquered assembly that turned out to be badly out of date the moment their advance fleet arrived. The Callan knew the assembly existed. They knew nothing about Corin's Verge, nothing about the Dead Moon installations, nothing about the seams. They knew only what the assembly had looked like from the outside 600 years earlier when a Callan explorer ship had passed the Midrim's edge and catalogued the resident species. They knew about the Vernesh, the Korvath, the Asuvane. And they knew about a young species called Kalan that had recently achieved interstellar travel and appeared to represent essentially no threat at all. Their arrival message broadcast across the General Council frequency at full power. Council translation systems needed 40 minutes to fully crack the language. It said that the Callan Dominion extended greetings to the species of the Midrim and had come to discuss their integration into Callan administrative structure and recommended full cooperation. The assembly received this message. A long silence followed. Then the Korvath military attaché, who had spent the past year and a half sitting in a chair, he never wanted thinking about dark corridors and things that moved through them, said quietly to nobody in particular that they clearly did not know. The assembly's emergency session was the fastest in its history, 12 minutes from the Callan transmission to a full quorum. A record. There was no debate over whether the message was hostile, no debate over whether integration into administrative structure meant exactly what it sounded like, no debate over whether we recommend cooperation was truly a recommendation. There was exactly one debate, and it lasted 47 minutes, and it concerned what to actually do. The Vernesh position was to contact the Callan requesting formal dialogue while stalling for time to assess the Council's military assets. Those assets, when assessed, were unimpressive. The Assembly had no standing fleet of its own. Individual species carried individual capacity ranging from significant among the Korvath to minimal among the Asuvane to deeply obscure among the Threnic, who had not formally disclosed their military structure in 200 years. A coordinated defense was theoretically possible. In theory, said the Korvath attaché who had been staring at the table for most of the session. Contact the Kalan, he said. Contact Selene. The room went quiet. The Vernesh representative looked at him and asked plainly if he was suggesting they ask humanity for help. What he wanted, he said with the specific precision of a man choosing each word from a very small set of options, was to inform the Kalan that a large hostile fleet sat at the edge of the Midrim and that the assembly would welcome their assessment of the situation. Everyone in the room understood this as a way of asking without ever saying the word asking. The Vernesh representative sent the message. Selene's reply arrived 19 minutes later. It said the Kalan were already aware of the Kalan and had been tracking their approach for approximately 2 years. It recommended the Assembly continue its own dialogue process and promised the Kalan would monitor the situation and advise if circumstances changed. The room read that message twice, then a third time. They knew the Vernesh representative said. Yes, said Illith from her seat at the analyst table where she had been asked to attend and had spent the entire session very still and very quiet taking notes she was not sure she would ever file anywhere. They knew for 2 years, he said. Yes, she confirmed, and they said nothing to us, but it might be worth considering what else they were doing during those 2 years. The room went quiet again. Somewhere beyond the station's sensors and the transit lanes, and the indifferent turning of the docking, Ring the Seams sat waiting in the dark. The Assembly opened dialogue with the Kalan. It was not a good dialogue. The Kalan had a particular conversational style that read less like discussion and more like announcement. Their lead representative was a broad, dark-scaled commander named Threk Vas Kalan, who carried the bearing of someone who had won a great many arguments simply by sitting slightly closer than the other party found comfortable. He sat across from the Vernesh representative and explained with patience and a small measure of warmth that the Kalan Dominion had a strong record of integrating independent systems, and that council species would find the process broadly beneficial if approached with the right attitude. The Vernesh representative asked what integration actually entailed. Threk explained at length. The summary sent to the full assembly through a closed channel read in careful formal language that the Kalan model involved formal absorption of governing structures under Kalan administrative authority, mandatory resource sharing agreements strongly favoring Kalan interests, and a transition period between 20 and 40 years during which local species governance would be supervised and progressively reduced. Historical precedent showed successful completion in 14 prior systems. A note at the bottom written in language far less formal said plainly that they meant for the council species to become subjects, and that no diplomatic path around this seemed to exist, and that suggestions were welcome. The next 3 days were among the most uncomfortable in recent assembly history. The Kalan fleet held position at the edge of the midrim and waited. They had clearly done this before. The waiting was patient and heavy and deliberate, the kind that communicates we're not in a hurry and you are not going anywhere. The Assembly sent Selene daily updates as a courtesy. She acknowledged each one. Her replies stayed brief and consistent and maddeningly calm. We are monitoring. We will advise if circumstances change. On the evening of the third day, Illith was in her office running the sensor cross-reference checks that had become an automatic habit since Corin's Verge. The kind of background scan she now ran the way some people check locks before bed. A data flag appeared. She stared at it and ran the check again. Then she picked up the direct line to the Vernesh senior representative and told him there was movement in the seams. He was quiet a moment before asking how much movement. She checked the readout. A great deal, she said. The Kalan received a transmission at 3 in the morning station time, not from the Assembly. The signal originated deep in the midrim interior well behind the Assembly's own position. Multiple origin points. 7 confirmed by Kalan detection systems, and an unknown number beyond that because those regions produced interference their chief technical officer could not immediately explain. The transmission carried a single human voice on audio alone. This is the Kalan Defense Directorate. You are currently inside a region of space under the protection of the Conquered Assembly and its member species. We are aware of your position and the nature of your proposal to the Assembly. We have been monitoring your approach for 26 months. We would like to offer some information before you make any further decisions. Commander Threk looked at his communications officer. She looked back at him. Continue, he said. You currently hold a fleet of approximately 400 vessels at the midrim edge, the voice continued. Significant capacity. We understand why you believe it is sufficient. We want to be clear with you. It is not for this particular region. The species of the Assembly have been under our protection for some time. You were not aware of this. We understand why. We have made deliberate choices about visibility. A pause followed. We are being visible now. Then the transmission cut and Threk's tactical display lit up. Not all at once. That detail stayed with the Kalan officers present for years afterward whenever they tried to describe those 4 minutes. Not all at once. The first signal was the largest. Sensors initially registered it as a single vessel before recalculating and producing a number that immediately flagged as anomalous. It appeared at the outer boundary between the Kalan fleet and open space in the dire. CDON they had come from. It was very large. The Kalan classification scale for vessel size ran from small patrol craft up to their largest category, which they called Class 9. The object on their display did not fit that scale at all. Their system assigned it a provisional Class 11 and flagged that no historical precedent existed for such a designation. Then the other signals arrived, not a flood, not a swarm, one at a time with gaps between them that felt to the Callan tactical crew like something deliberately choosing the timing, letting each one land, letting the number climb, 20, 40. By the time the count passed 60, the shape of the pattern became clear to Threk's own tactical team. The vessels were not forming a battle line. They were not massing for engagement. They were forming a perimeter around the entire Callan fleet, not aggressive. Not advancing, simply present, covering every approach vector. Every one of them running with no transponder and no registry signature on any identification system the Callan had ever developed. 80, 100, Threk's second-in-command asked very quietly where they had been hiding. Threk looked at the dead space where the vessels had emerged from regions his own sensors had shown as completely empty since arrival. Empty of structure, empty of energy signature, empty in every measurable way a stretch of space could be empty. They were there, he said, we simply could not see them. The voice returned. 112 vessels, it said. This is not the complete picture. We wanted you to be able to see something. We believed that was the honest approach. A pause that felt carefully timed followed. The complete picture is not something we put on display. We hope you understand. Threk sat very still. He understood with the exact clarity of a commander who has just run the numbers in his head and found an answer he did not want to say out loud. If they could see 112 ships, and this was still not the complete picture, then the complete picture was some multiple of that. How many dark regions had the Callan crossed simply reaching the midrim? How many of those regions had ever actually been surveyed? What separated we detected nothing from there was truly nothing there. He had been answering that question with total certainty for 600 years. He was no longer certain of anything. We have no interest in conflict, the voice said. We have never had an interest in conflict. The species of this council are our neighbors and our partners, and we intend to keep them safe. That is not a threat. It is simply a description of how things are. We are inviting you to understand how things are and to make your decisions accordingly. Another pause followed. We would also suggest avoiding any sudden movements. Some of our pilots are still fairly new. We would hate for anyone to grow nervous. Threk stared at the transmission terminal a long time. It was, he thought, an extraordinarily controlled performance. The 112 ships appearing from nothing, the perimeter, the calm, unhurried voice, the casual final line, all of it calibrated, all of it deliberate. He had come here to fold a handful of small species into the Dominion. He had arrived instead to find that the smallest of them, the newest of them, the one the old intelligence files described as soft and unlikely to matter militarily, had been sitting in the dark all around him the entire time. Open a response channel, he said. The negotiation took 3 weeks. It was not conducted by the Assembly. It was conducted between Commander Threk and Ambassador Selene Okoro, who arrived at the Midrim boundary aboard a single small unarmed ship and sat across a table from the commander of a 400-vessel fleet drinking coffee without appearing to feel any of the things Threk would have felt in her position. He tried authority first. She remained pleasant. He tried implication. She became clearer. He tried direct threat exactly once. She looked at him for a moment and then said, without moving or changing her tone at all, that there were currently 43 Kalan vessels within weapons range of his flagship, that his sensors were not showing them, that this was not a malfunction. He did not attempt that approach again. What they arrived at after 3 weeks was not quite a treaty. It was closer to an understanding. The Kalan were not being asked to abandon their goals or their culture or their relationship with the 14 systems already integrated. They were being asked to understand exactly where the boundary sat. The boundary was the midrim. Behind it stood species under Kalan protection. The Kalan remained welcome to trade and establish diplomatic relations and pursue anything civilizations pursue with each other in good faith. They were not welcome to pursue integration. Threk asked once what would happen if the Kalan chose to disagree with that boundary. Selene told him then they would find out exactly how much it cost, and she did not think either of them wanted that. He left. The entire fleet turned and departed, all 400 vessels tracked by the Assembly's sensor nets until they crossed back over the outer boundary and vanished into the region they had come from. The midrim went quiet again. The Assembly's session after the Kalan departure looked nothing like the sessions before it. No emergency, no urgency, no closed chambers or unofficial summaries passed to junior analysts through back channels. A regular session. A routine matter sat on the agenda. The Thrennic had filed a long pending question about beacon calibration in the outer shipping lanes that had been sitting in committee for 8 months. It was resolved in 20 minutes. Then the Vernesh senior representative looked around the room and said the assembly had a matter to formally address that had been waiting long enough. He looked toward the Kalan seat where Selene sat as she always did at regular sessions. Reliable and quiet, and apparently finding the beacon calibration discussion genuinely interesting. The assembly wished to formally acknowledge, he said, the role of the Kalan Defense Directorate and the Kalan government in the events of the past year and a half. Corin's Verge, the Kalan boundary negotiation, the ongoing protection the assembly had apparently been operating under for far longer than it had ever realized. He paused. The assembly also wished to formally acknowledge that its historical assessment of the Kalan species had been in several significant respects incorrect. The room stayed quiet. We categorized you as a young civilization, he said, developing, loud, prone to mistakes. Selene said nothing. We did not consider, he said, the possibility that the noise itself was a choice. Selene spoke for about 4 minutes. She never gave long speeches. She thanked the assembly for the acknowledgement. She said Kalan policy remained oriented toward cooperation and mutual security. She said the Kalan Defense Directorate would continue operating exactly the way it always had, which included some things that would stay unspecified, and that this was not going to change, but the assembly was welcome to think of it as a feature rather than a complication. She mentioned the coffee machine in the consultation room had been upgraded, and that everyone remained welcome to use it. The Korvath attaché in the back of the room made a sound no translation system on file could categorize. Then she said one more thing. She said it looking directly at Ilith, who sat at the analyst table in the corner as she always did, a position that let her see everyone in the room without ever becoming the center of anything. We never wanted to be the most powerful thing in this room, Selene said. We wanted to be the thing that made the room safe enough that power stopped being the measure. That is still what we want. It is what we will keep working toward. She sat down. Ilith wrote every word of it down. After the session, she returned to her office and opened her private chart. It had grown far larger by then. In the year and a half since she first started it, she had added dozens of markers, seams, patterns of absence, inferred positions, regions where council sensor coverage thinned and something else spread wide. It was an enormous chart now. And she understood clearly it still represented only a fraction of the truth. She thought about what Selene had said. We never wanted to be the most powerful thing in the room. She thought about 112 ships appearing out of nothing. About the calm, unhurried voice on the Kalan transmission saying this is not the complete picture. She thought about 2293 and a trade dispute nobody at the time had thought was important, and a species that had looked hard at the galaxy it had walked into and decided quietly, and with extraordinary patience, to make itself impossible to hurt. She thought about all the laughter, the private jokes, the training module the Korvath built, the 17-movement acoustic piece about humans needing to sleep every single night, the pheromone that meant bless their hearts. She thought about everything that had been happening in the dark while all of that happened in the light. She thought about the specific shape of the last 27 years. Then she closed the chart. She was going to need a much bigger file, new analytical frameworks, new categories entirely, new ways of thinking about what soft species actually meant once the soft species decided it was finished being tested. She also realized she was going to need to update roughly 40 different council classification documents. The one labeling humanity, a developing civilization unlikely to represent significant military presence, was the most urgently wrong. She started with that one. She typed the new classification slowly, making sure every word was correct, making sure it said exact. Lie what it needed to say without saying a single word more than necessary. The way Selene said things, the new classification read as follows. Kalan species reclassified as long-term strategic actor, significant military capacity of undisclosed extent, operates primarily through deterrence framework, historically non-aggressive, council protection relationship confirmed active, threat assessment to council members none, threat assessment to hostile actors targeting council members substantial. She paused at the end and added one final line. Note, do not assume you have the complete picture, you do not. She saved it, filed it, leaned back in her chair. Outside her window, the station's artificial night had already begun again. The stars sat exactly where they always sat. The dark between them was the same dark it had always been. It simply meant something different now, out there in the seams, in the dead spaces between sensor ranges and old survey data, in the cold shadow of moons with no registered inhabitants, in corridors that moved without ever showing themselves on a single scan. Humanity waited, patient, present, silent, not because it was hiding, because it had decided a long time ago in the middle of a trade dispute nobody else thought mattered that the galaxy was not always kind and that the answer to an unkind galaxy was never to be loud about your teeth. The answer was to let the galaxy wonder if you had any at all. And then when something finally came out of the dark toward the people you had decided were yours to protect, you let it see just enough. Just the fraction that made the math too large to want to test, the fraction that said this is not the complete picture. And then you watched it turn around and leave, and you went back to being quiet, and you waited, because the galaxy was old and vast and full of things that had not arrived yet, and humanity had all the time in the world. If this story hit you the way it hit me writing it, drop a like right now, because it genuinely helps this channel more than you know. And if you want more stories where humanity turns out to be the quiet thing everyone underestimated, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one. There are a lot more waiting in the dark. See you in the next story.